Hi, this is Elliot Fishman. Welcome to part 4 of our talk about cystic pancreatic lesions. And in this last part, I'm going to start off talking about neuroendocrine tumors that are cystic. I'll speak about SPEN tumors, and then we'll have some conclusions from everything we've said. Well, we talk about neuroendocrine tumors in general, we think about a hypervascular lesion, but they can be cystic. You can get a hypervascular halo. You can see Mets with cystic neuroendocrine tumors, but most of them are small and they're incidental. 25% are associated with MEN syndrome. We wrote this article a while back. Cystic neuroendocrine tumors almost always demonstrate the presence of either a peripheral rind of hypervascular enhancing soft tissue or hyperenhancement with mural nodules along the margin. So they do look a little bit different. And I think often you can appreciate and make the correct diagnosis, but it can be challenging. Because again, we can see other cystic lesions. You can see a thickened wall with some enhancement in an MCN. You could talk about an IPMN with high-grade dysplasia. So it's not a perfect diagnosis, but you can think about it. So here's a good example, a cystic lesion by the tail of the pancreas. Now, when you look at it, you can say maybe it's an IPMN, maybe it's an MCN, maybe it's just a pseudocyst. So you have to be very careful. You have to play around with the window width and center, and when you adjust it, and you can see on the venous here, the enhancing rim. You're not going to see an enhancing rim like this in an IPMN, obviously. You're not even going to see it looking like that in an MCN typically. So one of the key things is making and looking for that peripheral enhancement pattern. And that's really classic for a cystic neuroendocrine tumor. And here it is again when I do some volume rendering. Beautiful cystic lesion, rim enhancement. I got the diagnosis, cystic neuroendocrine. Here's another one. They can be larger. But again, you look at this and you say, well, MCN's a possibility. Cirrus adenoma, probably not, the wall's too thick. But then you start looking, there's some enhancement, but still I would be considering a MCN in the right age of the patient. Here's the coronal view, really thickened wall. If this is an MCN, you would worry that it would be a high-grade dysplasia with nodularity. But the rim enhancement is more typical for a neuroendocrine tumor. And again, as I showed you in the last case, when you do the volume rendering, the cystic component and rim enhancement is better defined, and you could make the suggestion a patient with a neuroendocrine tumor this size obviously is going to have a distal pancreatectomy because you worry about malignancy and you worry about liver metastasis. Cystic neuroendocrine tumors can be very large. This one in the head of the pancreas, right? You can think about a cirrus adenoma, but the wall is too thick. It could be an MCN, not a great location, but thickened wall, high-grade dysplasia are possibilities. Patients young enough, or even sometimes we see in older patients, a SPEN tumor would be a possibility. This was a cystic neuroendocrine tumor. Again, the rim enhancement, the thickened wall, the nodularity, but not the easiest diagnosis, but it's something you should obviously consider. And here it is in the coronal view. So again, you could even consider here, well, you're not going to consider a solid cirrus adenoma, but you could say, well, could this be a cirrus adenoma? But there's too much nodularity in the inferior aspect. I would worry, could I be dealing with an MCN? Cystic neuroendocrine tumors are a really good bet. Another lesion, body-tail junction. There's a cystic lesion. If you look at this, you could start thinking about an MCN. You can think about a cirrus adenoma. It's well defined. There's no dilated pancreatic duct. But when you do the reconstructions, you can see that it's not connected to the duct. MCN is something you would think about, but here it has a little bit more of an enhancing rim. Here it is again with a solid component. And you can see why an MCN would be a great diagnosis here. In fact, the more I look at this case, I like MCN better than cystic neuroendocrine tumor. And of course, this was a cystic neuroendocrine tumor. And here it is very nicely shown on the cinematic rendering as well. Now, I mentioned about solid serous cystadenomas before and how they can look very much like neuroendocrine tumors. Both of them can wash out, but usually the serous cystadenoma washes out much more. Neuroendocrine tumors wash out, but they're still very vascular and venous. The solid serous cystadenomas typically wash out substantially, okay? We talk about vessel stretching with a cirrus. We talk about vessel invasion with a peanut. And of course, you want to look carefully at the liver. If you see enhancing liver lesions and you're concerning for Mets, then it's most likely going to be a neuroendocrine tumor. Again, fluid markers in EUS, Pancreatic, VHL marker, 98% for serous cystadenoma. So that can help you be very specific. So that's what we talk about with neuroendocrine tumors. Can be very challenging, which is why this lecture is here, because it's easy to show one case and say this is what it is, but when you're dealing with patient after patient and you have to help decide how to manage the patient, it is challenging. The last thing I'll mention is solid pseudopapillary neoplasms or SPEN tumors. These are the ones that are in the younger patients. Average size about 5 centimeters, cystic and solid components. Calcifications can be extensive, or there could be an absence of calcifications, but more than 1/3 of cases will have calcification. More common in the tail, but can be anywhere. Now, what usually helps is if you tell me the patient has a cystic pancreatic lesion or a pancreatic lesion, they're 11 years old and they're female. Okay, pancreaticoblastomas can occur in children, but that's usually under 10. When you have a cystic lesion like this, if patient's 50, you would really think about possibilities, including cancer. But an 11-year-old, that's going to be a SPEN tumor. You can see the mass projects down. There's some faint calcification in the lesion. Here's another SPEN tumor, cystic lesion in a young patient in the head of the pancreas, very well defined. Here's a 33-year-old female. I mentioned SPENs can calcify. They can calcify centrally, almost looking like a serous cystadenoma, but most of the time the calcifications are in the periphery and they're multiple linear calcifications. And again, 33 is a good age. This could be a serous cystadenoma. That's a possibility. But again, the serous is usually 60, 70, not 33. And here it is very nicely shown on the coronal views and the volume rendering. You would not be thinking about a cystic neuroendocrine tumor. I would probably not be thinking about an MCN, but you could mention it because MCNs can calcify. But again, usually it's peripheral, not central like this. Here's another example of a SPEN in the head of the pancreas with rim-like calcification. The lesion is cystic. Again, younger patient. Very nicely shown here. You can see on the volume rendering really the calcifications. So when I start seeing calcifications, most of the time in SPEN, I like to think about the calcifications around the periphery of the tumor. But as I showed you a few moments ago, they can be central or they can be both. Here's a larger SPEN tumor. Again, look at the calcifications. A much larger lesion, you could have thought about an MCN in this case, and you should think about that, but this was a SPEN tumor. SPENs are great mimickers. I mentioned teenagers, 20s, female. I've seen SPENs in 80-year-old males. So you're not always going to be working it out based on the demographics. Here's that same case with the peripheral calcification. Very good for a SPEN tumor. And here's just a few more views, giving you an idea about the range of SPEN tumors. Now, the good news about SPEN tumors, you will resect them. It's about a 90 to 95% cure rate. Some of them recur, some of them metastasize to the liver, but typically when they're detected early, 95% success rate, and the patients get surgery and no other therapy. And here's an article we wrote, Taha Ahmed, about this. Calcifications are present in roughly 1/3 of these SPENs and are more frequently encountered in larger tumors, Although peripheral curvilinear calcification is the most classic, calcifications will vary, and I did show you a nice example of a central calcification. So again, calcified lesions, you got to think about spens, you got to think about cirrus adenomas, you have to think about MCNs, a number of things you need to think about. And also neuroendocrine tumors, even cystic or solid neuroendocrine tumors, will commonly calcify. Now, one thing to mention also in cystic lesions that's fairly rare is lymphopithelial cysts. Age range in the 50s, incidental. They tend to be cystic, but they're like coming off the gland. When you look at them, they're often large, up to 13 centimeters, but you somehow look and you say, is this near the pancreas or from the pancreas? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Lymphopithelial cysts could look identical to a lymphangioma. One of the things about them, they're so exophytic, you want to be very careful. Now, you really have to think about it. You hate to do EUS because patients with lymphopithelial cysts often get really bad pancreatitis post-biopsy. So you have to think about it. Here's a nice cystic lesion that's almost abutting the pancreas. If you look at it here, you could say a lymphangioma, mesenteric cyst, but this was a lymphoepithelial cyst. But on the coronals, you can see it scalloping the gland right here. When I see scalloping, that's a lymphopithelial cyst. Lymphangioma, mesenteric cyst are going to have mass effect, but the borders are going to be very, very smooth. And here's that same case with cinematic rendering. Now, the future. We started off mentioning we need to classify lesions better. AI, we're working on that. AI and deep learning are going to improve detection, they're going to improve classification, and they're going to help with patient management. So I'm very, very excited about that. So concluding then, cystic pancreatic neoplasms, there's a range of possibilities from malignancies like MCNs to benign lesions like serous adenomas to lymphopithelial cysts to MCNs. You got it. Often they'll have classic appearances. They're easy. Age helps us. Demographics helps us. The appearance helps us. I showed you how cinematic rendering can be very helpful. Some lesions will need resection because you worry about malignancy. Some will need resection like a serous because of mass effect and symptoms. The importance of using EUS in the right group of patients, looking at some of the new staining, like the VHL marker, will become very, very important. And I think in the future, AI will prove to be a game changer. And we are working hard on that now. Take a look at some of our articles and you can see where we're going. And with that, have a great day. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the CTisus YouTube channel. You can also visit us at ctisus.com for even more videos, plus quizzes, pearls, protocols, and oh so much more. We're also in the App Store and have well over a dozen apps for iPhone and iPad, all completely free. Thanks for watching.